Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the third lecture in our IBC and Commerce Bank Keynote Speaker Series for 2020 and 2021. I am George Clark, the Director of the Center for the Study of Western Hemispheric Trade in TAMIU's A.R. Sanchez Junior School of Business. Our center, together with the IBC and Commerce Bank, brings speakers virtually this year due to the COVID epidemic, talk about a variety of topics in the areas of international trade, economics, finance, and demography. Before introducing tonight's speaker, I want to thank our sponsors for supporting this event, IBC and Commerce Bank. With their support, we've been able to bring many thought-provoking speakers throughout the years to TAMIU and Laredo. At the end of Dr. Noorani's presentation, there'll be a question and answer session. If you submit your questions through the chat feature, the Q&A feature, then I will try to get the speaker to answer as many as I can. So, thank you very much for coming. Today's speaker is Ali Narani, the President and Chief Executive Officer of the National Immigration Forum based in Washington, D.C. Mr. Narani holds a Master's in Public Health from Boston University and is a graduate of UC Berkeley. He's also the author of a book on immigration titled, There Goes the Neighborhood, How Communities Overcome Prejudice and Meet the Challenge of American Immigration. Mr. Narani has appeared on Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, and many other news programs to discuss these issues. Mr. Narani's presentation is entitled Reconciling a Nation of Immigrants. With the new administration in Washington, D.C., once again considering immigration reform, this is a particularly timely topic. We'd like to thank Mr. Narani for visiting TAMIU and Laredo virtually and sharing his experience and expertise with us. Thank you, Dr. Narani.
Thank you so much, Dr. Clark, and I hope everybody is doing well. It was so great to be there a few years back, and really want to thank the sponsors of the event, IBC Bank and Commerce Bank, and really, again, want to thank the TAMIU leadership and the staff, Dr. Clark and Amy Palacios as well. So I really, really appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation afterwards as well. So with that, let's get started. And I want to start with a story, and it's a story where it took place on a quiet Sunday morning. It was 723 days after the inauguration of President Donald J. Trump. I was at a McDonald's warming up with a $1 cup of coffee, which on my dollar is the best dollar you're ever going to spend if you need a cup of coffee. There's plastic seating, pleasant paint, smiling staff, laughing teenagers, parents corralling young families, elderly folks sitting quietly alone. Quite frankly, it could have been any McDonald's in any town USA on any day in January, but it was not. As children were eagerly watching their Happy Meals, I was fixated on the rust-colored steel bollards not more than 2 blocks away. 18 feet high, they sliced through downtown Nogales, Arizona, and the top glistened with razor wire. This wasn't the first time I'd seen a border fence cleave a community into two. More during the Bush and the Obama administrations, I'd seen how the fortification of the U.S.-Mexico border had fundamentally changed border regions. But it was different. Because though this fence had been a defining element of the Nogales skyline since 2011, there was an edge, an ugliness, represented by the addition of the gleaming coils of concertina wire. It was a physical manifestation of the rhetoric, the policy, and the partisanship that was dominating and continues to dominate Washington, D.C. It was a preview of the fencing and the razor wire that would surround the U.S. Capitol in the final days of the Trump administration. Now, looking back, violence did certainly occur along the border. Lives were certainly lost. The essence and the personality of communities like Nogales on either side of the border were fundamentally questioned. Yet, what also made the concertina wire so alarming was that it represented a clear and present threat to the dignity and the humanity of those who lived near, worked along, and crossed the border every day. The nation's, if not the world's, immigration debate was captured at that moment by what I saw through that McDonald's window. Two cities, socially and economically connected for generations, separated not by a line, not by a fence, not even by a wall, but by the very deterrent first used during World War I, razor wire. Look, as a result of decades of efforts by opponents to immigrants and immigration, the Trump administration had robbed immigrants and all of us of dignity by this razor wire and everything else around it. So restoring our dignity as people, reconciling our nation of immigrants, begins at the border. The question is, in the context of immigration, how do you legislate dignity? It's often only, in the eyes of the beholder, where dignity is a term that's used by all sides of the political debate to frame their policy position of choice. But dignity also provides a way for us to rise above the political fray, so that we can understand how opposing policy choices both have some amount of dignity. The question is whether or not opponents, through their rhetoric and their proposals, respect or honor the dignity of the other. Because only then can we reconcile our differences and reach the much-needed compromises our nation needs. Now let me be clear, not all Americans will agree that we need to treat immigrants or each other with dignity. These Americans have been radicalized by white extremist ideology, or even worse, they've been mobilized to violence. So I argue that we focus our attention on the tens of millions of our fellow Americans who are vulnerable to these ideologies, who, if they get scared enough by immigration, get angry enough by immigration, will follow an in-group to radicalization and violence. As much as immigration drives people to consider joining these far-right extremist ideologies, immigration can also offer a path to dignity for all. And this path begins with how we value each other. When it comes to immigration, a legal immigrant who is highly paid, well-educated, for example, a doctor who is providing services to the white community, that individual is seen both personally by, we're led to believe, as well as by our system as deserving dignity. The current immigration system, the visa that individual may have, allows them to enter based on their education level and technical abilities, as well as labor market needs. It's easier for them to bring their families. There are opportunities for them to adjust their immigration status and remain in the country permanently. There's often even times where the employers will help that individual through that process. Through these policies, the system has deemed this individual who was, quote, high skilled as deserving the dignity of family and of permanence. But let's look at the other end of the spectrum. For example, a laborer, documented or not, uneducated by traditional measures, earning wages from the work that they do with their hands. We're not led to believe that they are dignified or that they deserve dignity. The assumption is that the lower skilled, the less educated an immigrant is, the less value they are to our economy and our society in the long term. This assumption is that they are of less value is shaped by a deep systemic bias. For laborers from construction to service to agriculture, eligibility for limited work visa programs are, for the most part, based on seasonal, short-term labor demand. It's also nearly impossible for these workers' families to join them, much less for these workers to adjust their status and to remain in the United States so that they can pursue their own long-term American dream. Our lack of respect for the dignity of their work is codified through a system that treats them as a cog in the economic wheel, not as a human being who should have the opportunity to live up to their fullest potential, or even access to basic services like healthcare. For the most part, human dignity is not part of the policy question when it comes to immigration, particularly for those that we do not deem as skilled or long-term benefit to our economy or society. As a result, it's easier for our political debates to frame immigrants as threats to the physical safety and health of Americans. And finally, in some ways, this is even more important. As we categorize labor into low-skilled and high-skilled, and we judge their dignity as such, whether that work is done by folks who are born here or that it's done by immigrants, we are shifting and undermining how we value work, particularly work that's done on the front lines of our economy. As a result, it's easier to pit frontline workers against one another, to claim immigrants are taking low-income jobs, and to use fear to motivate low-income native-born workers to make political decisions. So how we value and how we understand and how we look at the work that people are doing, whether they're immigrant or not, has implications not just on how we see immigrants and immigration, but how we see the economy writ large. And again, so much of this is baked into, cooked into the way that our immigration system is designed. As Michael Rosen put it in his book, Dignity, he writes, in failing to respect the humanity of others, we actually undermine the humanity in ourselves. So let's spend a little time to understand how we got here. Not from a policy or a political perspective, although we can talk about that, but from a cultural perspective. Now, there's a famous saying that goes, politics is downstream from culture. So my question to you, if we were all in the same room, would be, who said that? Who came up with that? The person who came up with that was Andrew Breitbart, founder of Breitbart News. And you know what? He was absolutely correct. In fact, over the course of his life, he reshaped American culture and hence American politics. Before he founded Breitbart News, Andrew Breitbart helped both the Drudge Report and the Huffington Post, two very different news platforms, both emerge as powerful news sites which allowed him to see how trust in institutions and national leaders was beginning to crumble. And he saw that by serving up news that was highly curated for specific tastes, the sites were able to tap into massive online audiences, creating communities that were quite separate from one another, but also deeply suspicious of one another. And Breitbart News went one step further than the Drudge Report or Huffington Post. Both of those sites, in essence, were aggregators for the most part in terms of pulling together a certain kind of universe of stories and sources. Breitbart News, rather than relying on aggregation of stories, built out a conservative news wire service. They did not have to wait for news to emerge that fit into their cultural framework. Rather, they published the news that would shape the culture to their liking. And they understood how the deep extremist recesses of the internet could over time be brought into the mainstream through articles and news focusing on an anti-immigrant message. Now, to a certain degree, the election of Trump in 2016 was the realization of the Breitbart doctrine that politics is downstream from culture. But in August of 2017, events aligned to crystallize that the nation faced then, but the challenge that we continue to face today. That August, in an opposition to an effort to remove a statue of Robert E. Lee, Richard Spencer and a band of alt-right activists descended upon Charlottesville, Virginia, and they chanted, "You will not replace us," while they held tiki torches. The show of force by white nativists led to violent confrontations, and one young woman was killed by a white nationalist. This was all being kind of driven and talked about and reported on through Breitbart News, specifically in terms of a very specific alt-right nativist message, but is clearly also being picked up by other mainstream news sources as the violence started to pick up. After the incident where the young woman was killed, President Trump held a press conference in New York. And this is the press conference where he said, there are very fine people on both sides. But at that press conference, he also said about the effort to remove Confederate statues. This week, it is Robert E. Lee. I wonder, is it George Washington next week? And is it Thomas Jefferson the week after? You know, you really do have to ask yourself, where does it stop? There was blowback against Trump from the mainstream media as well as others in kind of the center and the center right. And 2 days later, he doubled down and he tweeted, "Sad to see the history and culture of our great country being ripped apart with the removal of our beautiful statues and monuments." Notice the term history and culture, that phrase. He was very clear in terms of his understanding of where the culture was going and how it allowed him to shape a political agenda. Andrew Breitbart's conservative wire service had created a culture that was moving politics of the White House to the extreme right. Trump's statements and lack of restorative action restorative action, was brought into clear relief 10 days later when he issued the first pardon of his administration. Now, this pardon was not for someone that, Kanye West or Kim Kardashian was advocating for. It wasn't for a pardon for someone who'd been caught up in the tentacles of our unjust criminal justice system. Politically speaking, when you look back, that would have been a fairly brilliant way for Trump to, quote, own the libs if he had done that. Instead, 10 days after Charlottesville, after white nationalists had raised their ugly heads and killed someone, President Trump pardoned Joe Arpaio, the former sheriff of Maricopa County, after he was convicted of criminal contempt related to his pursuit of undocumented immigrants. As sheriff, Arpaio was an early adopter of extremist views, and since 2000, in fact, Arpaio had appeared at nativist events in Arizona that were frequented by neo-Nazis and had used petitions circulated by extremists to justify his immigration dragnets. Trump wasn't looking for reconciliation. He sought to divide the country by race, and immigration provided him an opportunity to continue to do so. Again, that's just one example of how culture shaped the politics, and that over the last 4 years, we've seen over 1,000 immigration-related policy changes as a result of that shift. It feels overwhelming because it is overwhelming. But since this isn't a 4-day speech and a symposium on all 1,064 changes, let's move ahead and let's talk about this question of how do we restore the dignity of America and Americans, and how do we reconcile a nation of immigrants? But let me be really clear. I'm not naive enough to think that polarization is going to disappear. Polarization has always been and will always be a part of American politics. We're a diverse people, we're a diverse nation, and we're getting more diverse. Disagree is what we do. Managing disagreements, quite frankly, is kind of the point of our democracy. But since the turn of the century, the erosion of trust has undermined so much, so that political polarization and economic inequity has led to growing mistrust of institutions, private or public. By 2019, the Pew Research Center had found that clear majorities of Americans think that the public's trust has been declining in both the federal government and their fellow citizens. And the hard part about all this is that trust is tangible in the way that people operate, right? I trust you, so I'm going to work with you. I don't trust you, so I'm not going to work with you, right? But trust is intangible in the way that it is perceived. In a rules-based society without trust, making changes is really hard, if not nearly impossible. But to rebuild trust, which is incredibly difficult, one must understand what is driving the mistrust. Since 2000, the annual Edelman Trust Barometer has measured trust and credibility around the world. Upon their publication of their 20th survey, which I think was in 2020 last year, Edelman wrote, "Fears are stifling hope. As long-held assumptions about the benefits of hard work and citizenship have been upended, 83% of employees globally are worried about job loss due to concerns such as the lack of training, cheaper foreign competition, immigration, automation, and the gig economy." Moreover, they wrote, over half of our respondents said that they are losing the respect and the dignity that they once enjoyed in their country. This all goes back in many ways to that value of work, how we're valuing the work of each other, how we're valuing the work of the other. Because if we are valuing somebody's work and contributions, they feel that dignity and their respect. So there's something that's happening within our society that is devaluing work and leading to large part to these divisions. People at the end of the day feel like the institutions around them, whether they're governments or corporations, are not looking out for their interests. And the challenge is that without anyone that a majority of Americans trust to explain these changes, people are left with their friends and family networks to receive information that they will trust. And the thing is that our friends and our family networks, we're all receiving the same information from the same source. For some of us, it's Fox News and Breitbart. For others of us, it's MSNBC. We all live in our bubbles. In this deluge of information, most of us have no time to kind of cull the news sources. What did my mom forward to me this morning from WhatsApp? Where did she get that from? What did my cousin send to me yesterday, and where did I get that information? So what we see in our Facebook newsfeed, it feeds into our preconceived understanding of the problem. So then we share that post with our friend and our family networks. And suddenly, ordinary people with ordinary fears become conveyors of easy to understand, at times dubious, memes and videos that marginalize and dehumanize the other, which more times than not these days is the immigrant. As a result, over time, the space for dialogue or compromise has disappeared. Debate is just loud and it's fast, and the louder and the faster become more powerful. And before we know it, trust is not social in terms of community level trust, it's deeply personal in terms of you'll trust only your friends and your families. So that personal trust quickly becomes tribal, because the person in your tribe looks like you and believes like you. From this environment comes a political milieu that allows leaders like Donald Trump here, a Nigel Farage in the UK, a Viktor Orban in Hungary, to grab the coattails of discontent to achieve massive political victories. And for all three of them, those victories were possible because they added race and immigration to the swirling mix of polarization, inequity, and mistrust, to push past populism and into the ugly spheres of nationalism and then white nationalism. All of this threatens to tear apart families. But there are amazing things that are happening across the country. And let me just share with you a couple of examples to give us a sense of how we can move forward. Back in 2018, the organization that I lead, the National Immigration Forum, we launched what we called a learning campaign. And what we sought to do is put together living room conversations of conservative and moderate faith, law enforcement, and business leaders in conservative parts of the country. Over the course of about 3 months, we did over 24 of these events, of these conversations. In the conversations, we sought to gain a deeper understanding of the attitudes that shape perceptions of immigrants and immigration. And we entered the process to learn, not to explain. We didn't have these conversations to try to dissuade somebody of their perceptions or their beliefs around immigration. Rather, we wanted them to kind of describe them to us and what they were seeing in their respective communities with great detail. And the first question we would ask in these groups was, how do you identify yourself? And in Southern California, a February 2018 conversation included a woman who, with her husband, had planted what had grown to be one of the largest evangelical churches in the state. Their socially conservative beliefs had defined their lives and their underlying values. But when it came to immigration, these values had not brought them to a place where you might think. About 10 or 12 years ago, they realized that their community was changing and that there were more Latinos in their city and they were coming to their church. So to this first question of how do you identify yourself, she responded, I'm very vanilla, I'm boring, small business owner, conservative, Republican, Christian. The conversation would then shift to immigration and how conservative communities and their families were feeling about a changing America. Because at this point, her eyes started to well with tears. And this woman of faith who had planted a church that had become the spiritual home to thousands upon thousands told us, I can't have that conversation with my brother or my dad about anything political without it becoming absolutely unbearable in seconds. She went on to say, their reaction is driven out of a sense of fear that they're going to lose their security or identity. As I watched her speak, I saw the pain on her face. I heard the anguish in her voice. And I realized that on one hand, she was working really hard to be a better leader and a better community member to the immigrants who were not just in her church, but in her life. But what she was afraid of is that she might lose her family along the way. The fear that she spoke to is indicative of the challenge that we face, because fear is the most powerful of emotions. It drives families north from Honduras to seek grace and compassion in the United States, whatever the risk. Fear also drives the U.S. to pass new laws, to build walls, because they're told, or I should say we are told, that we will lose our culture, our security, our jobs because of migration. Well, now, these days, now with one of the nation's major political parties torn asunder by xenophobes and white supremacists, they want to drag many Republicans closer to extremism. The challenge then when it comes to immigration is to differentiate between the persuadable conservative, in essence the person who has questions, and the racist conservative, the person who is down the path to extremism. So like I said at the beginning, we need to focus our attention and our efforts on the folks who can be persuaded and who are vulnerable to moving to more extremist ideologies. But if we have that conversation with them, we can help them, we can help ourselves understand how we can reach the compromises that we need. Finding this, not just the differentiation, but developing a way to have those conversations requires an understanding of in-groups and out-groups. At their most basic, an in-group is a group to which a person identifies as being a member, while an out-group is a social group with which an individual does not identify. A University of Missouri study found that when threatened, individuals found protection among their in-groups. These days, our in-groups are found across race, religion, ethnicity, geography, and politics, and more. When our in-groups used to be limited by a physical connection, now Facebook and other social media platforms have exploded the size and the intensity of our in-groups, and more importantly, how we view and perceive outgroups. Look, Facebook did not call them Facebook groups for nothing. So in-groups are just convenient and powerful political instruments because they feed the hungry beast that is political polarization. Because in a deeply polarized world, candidates first must mobilize a base of primary voters, typically through anger and emotion, and in a handful of specific geographies where they might have a tight general election, slice away just enough voters in the persuadable margins for them to eke out a victory, which makes the business of digital media incredibly powerful. Because if a candidate can mobilize different ecosystems or different in-groups of voters, the math can be put together to get them to the majority that they need. And the fact that these media bubbles are so independent of one another and create such intensely loyal followings, particularly when you're talking about an issue like immigration, which has such high salience, particularly for conservative voters, these in-groups are all the more powerful. In fact, the fracturing of digital space has bolstered one's political identity. What you like, what you share on digital platforms, defines you politically and culturally with your friends and family. You are a Republican or you're a Democrat. There's nothing in between. And to switch from one side to the other just doesn't take courage because you're breaking away from your friends and your family networks, but oftentimes it's seen as a form of cultural treason. So our challenge here is, or our opportunity, is to build the bridges between in-groups that will move the country forward and help people who are persuadable or who are vulnerable to more extremist ideologies when it comes to immigration, but to be able to build a bridge so that they can feel comfortable and confident leaving one in-group that says, we should never let in another immigrant, to another in-group that says, you know what, we've got to be thinking about this differently. And immigration, of all things, is an issue that can build that bridge. In early 2018, a segment of white evangelicals who overall voted for Trump in 2016 in massive numbers, they began to question their decision. More specifically, the Pew Research Center in the spring of 2018 found that support among white evangelical women had dropped about 13 percentage points to 60%. Now, they were not ready to go public with their differences and break with their in-group. Instead, they met, quote, in secret in private Facebook groups to discuss their support of Trump. Around this time, in spring of 2018, we were seeing that migration from Central America to the U.S.-Mexico border was gaining prominence in the public debate, and more specifically, the Trump administration's family separation policy that went on to separate well over 5,000 children from their parents. In June 2018, a couple months later, as this particular policy has kind of reached peak saturation within the public, in June 2018, the Public Religion Research Institute found that although white evangelical Protestants have been the most ardent supporters of President Trump, only 36% favor this policy, while 51% are opposed. The fact is that the sights and the sounds of children taken from their parents had been seared into the minds of social conservatives. But their in-groups were Trump voters, who were their friends, their families, and their fellow churchgoers. In order to move away from this tight-knit group, they needed a bridge. And the bridge was their faith. For the New York Times, Elizabeth Diaz told the story of 4 conservative evangelical women in Texas in the weeks leading up to the 2018 election. All attended conservative evangelical churches in Dallas. All, quote, were longtime Republican voters solely because they oppose abortion rights. Tess Clark was one of those women interviewed by the New York Times. And she confessed that she was, quote, mortified at her abortion-centric past votes. Now, she told the reporter, I care as much about babies at the border as I do about babies in the womb. She said, we've been asleep, now we've woke up. Now look, culture wars are often portrayed as left versus right, secular versus deeply religious. In wars, there are no switching of sides, no willingness to compromise. The strategies and the language of, quote, a war aims for the outright defeat of the opposition. Immigration ranks very high among the culture war issues in America, which made the story of Tess Clark all the more interesting. Because in a follow-up interview with the New York Times podcast, The Daily, she spoke of how deeply rooted that she was in Christian culture. At the private Christian school of her childhood, for example, she told the host about learning about the U.S. presidents in the 4th grade. And her teacher would, quote, make a fart noise for Clinton because when Democrats were in office, it was bad for Christians. Clark went on to graduate from college and then teach in a school where, she told the Daily, almost all of my students were immigrants in the U.S., mostly from different parts of Central America and Mexico. And some of their parents were undocumented. But the proximity to the community did not change Tessa's politics. As she told the Daily, there was still this belief in me that the Republican Party was the only party a Christian could vote for. She felt, quote, if I'm going to protect myself and my future children, we need a Republican in office. The breaking point for Tess was when then Attorney General Jeff Sessions made a speech on June 14, 2018, where he justified the family separation policy by citing Romans 13 and the belief in the rule of law. Tess told the Daily, to kind of defend why they were separating families at the border, he used scripture. She said, I remember watching that and yelling at the TV, don't do that. She went on the podcast, her voice got higher. She said, be racist, be whatever you're being, but don't use scripture to back it up and defend it. Don't defame God that way. Now, for a conservative evangelical woman like Tess Clark, her faith was a bridge away from the political identity that had advocated for the separation of families. As Diaz explained, it wasn't they were no longer pro-life when it comes to abortion, it's that they have these other competing ideas of what that identity, that pro-life identity, means, particularly when it comes to immigration and race. Tess said, I believe that being pro-life is pro-all life. From the Syrian person who's fleeing bombs, to the Honduran immigrant, to the child separated at the border, to the kid in foster care, to the baby in their mother's womb. If I'm pro-life, I'm looking at all of that life. So, what does an immigration agenda look like that garners the support of someone like Tess Clark, who grew up in a socially conservative community and family? What is an immigration agenda that restores the dignity of immigrants in America and that sets the stage for our reconciliation of our nation of immigrants? And it's not going to be easy. Just yesterday, there was new polling that came out from an organization called Populous. And it was very interesting because I was kind of putting the speech together. I came upon it in the news last night. It was interesting because they framed it as the American Aspirations Index. And it really brought into clear focus how much work we have to do. The index offers a window into what people personally prioritize and what they perceive that society prioritizes. And the researchers found that no single subject exhibits partisans' contested aspirations for the country more starkly than immigration. Trump voters ranked the national aspiration that America severely restricts immigration as the third most important personally held aspiration out of 55. So the third most important aspiration for a Trump voter out of a list of 55 was that America aspires to severely restrict immigration. Biden voters ranked that aspiration at number 46, all the way at the bottom of their list. But there's a really interesting difference here between somebody's personal aspirations and the perception of society's aspirations. Biden voters ranked that aspiration of severely restricted immigration, like I said, at 46. They believe society ranks severe restriction of immigration at number 6. In this case, Biden voters perceive society to be more restrictive than their personal opinion. When asked about the aspiration that America is open to immigration, Trump voters rank it near the bottom at 52. But they believe society is more open to immigration, and they believe that society ranks immigration at number 21. All to say, kind of the nut of our challenge, the nut of our problem is that Biden voters think America aspires to be more restrictive when it comes to immigration. Trump voters believe America aspires to be more open when it comes to immigration. The reconciliation of our nation of immigrants means that we need to close that gap. So what does it mean from a policy perspective? It means we have to be cognizant of our language. It means that we have to understand how these issues are perceived within a particular in-group. So to close, let me run through just a handful of policy recommendations. First of all, we are not at war with Mexico. We can manage and secure our border while respecting the people who live along the border. The ugly symbolism of concertina wire does nothing to keep us secure. So let's pull down the razor wire and move forward with data-oriented security solutions that keep all of us safe. For example, second, invest in security solutions that are based on risk. The data shows that the majority of drugs, guns, and money are smuggled through ports of entry. So let's invest our security dollars, our border security dollars at ports of entry in ways that not only keep us safe, but facilitates trade. Third, let's establish a process at the border and in Central America for migrants to pursue asylum claims safely. For too many years, we've outsourced our immigration system to cartels who tried to smuggle in the person who paid the most or held migrants for ransom in Mexico. We need to manage our border and our immigration processes in a way that keeps the nation safe and assures that those with legit asylum claims can pursue their cases in a safe fashion. The status quo is only serving the cartels. Fourth, let's carefully reopen the border to families who are seeking protection. Engaging international organizations like UNHCR and IOM is smart policy in that they have experience on how to manage these flows around the world that they can bring to our border. This, again, keeps us safe, but it also treats families compassionately and fairly. Fifth, on the interior, let's make sure that we're honoring the dignity of the essential worker who's standing shoulder to shoulder with the native-born to help the nation through the response and the recovery to COVID-19. Those who are undocumented workers in the essential workforce, approximately 5 million people, should be able to own the American dream as United States citizens. Whether they're nursing home attendants or farm workers, through their contributions in our greatest moment of need, they have earned the American dream. Sixth, let's establish an immigration system that treats us all with dignity, particularly those who are within years of retirement. Because in order for them to retire safely and to a social security system that will be solvent, we need to be increasing our immigration levels by 37%. And finally, seventh, let's make sure that community organizations, churches, businesses, police departments, local governments are fully invested in the integration of our newest neighbors through a national commitment to English language training and citizenship. This 7-point plan speaks to the self-interest of the American worker and their family. It treats immigrants with dignity. It restores the dignity of our country, and it begins the process of closing that gap between what people see as their priorities and what they perceive as society's priorities. Now, again, none of this is going to be easy, but if we're going to restore dignity to our immigration system, we truly need to be a nation of laws and a nation of grace. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Noorani, for that excellent talk. It's very interesting, and very timely for us at living at the border. What we're going to do now is we're going to go into the Q&A session. So, if you're in the audience and you're listening to me now, feel free to type your questions into the chat Q&A, and then I will try to get to as many as I possibly can to ask Mr. Narani to answer them. I will say that I am going to take the chair's prerogative by asking the first question to you. And you talked a lot about in-groups and these kind of issues. One thing I'm interested in is you talked about the white nationalist aspect to the Republican Party. I'm kind of interested on your take on why President Trump ended up doing better in 2020 than in 2016 in many areas, such as the Texas border, for example, where you would expect these policies to be especially unpopular. What was it about them that made them interesting? And please, everybody else, start typing your questions so that we can get to them.
So I think there's something interesting is happening here. So in the country, and a lot of this is driven, I think, by the way that the Democratic Party assumes how Latinos and Hispanics are feeling about these issues. And some people will say, there's a kind of a growing conventional wisdom that this difference and kind of the uptick in support that Trump got from Hispanic voters was due to a difference in education. I'm kind of wonder if it's a little bit more complicated than that. So I think one thing that's happening here is that Democrats are being driven by and large by your very large blue cities and your very large progressive cities, and they are talking about issues like defunding, abolishing ICE, and they are in essence kind of removing the idea that communities want to see a functioning and a fair and a just criminal justice system. But when you look closely kind of within the Hispanic community or the Black community or communities of color, there is a different sort of relationship and a reliance, I shouldn't say reliance, but a relationship with law enforcement. So that I think that, when Democrats are talking about abolishing ICE or defunding the police or socialism, they are not speaking to the bottom line interests of many communities of color in terms of wanting to live in a safe community, wanting to be able to start a business, wanting to make sure that government is working for them. So I think what happened there is that Democrats, driven by the progressive left, overreached, quite frankly, and they weren't speaking to just the bottom line issue, bread and butter issues that I think most Americans, whether they're Hispanic, African American, or white or Asian, have every day. So I think Democrats need to recalibrate how they are talking about these issues. But I also think that Republicans, they have pushed away at the same level a number of college-educated voters who may not see themselves as budding socialists or people who want to defend the police, but they also want their government, our government, not just to treat people fairly, but to treat people compassionately. And I think what you saw from a lot of white college-educated voters in general, is just kind of weighing out of these balancing of these interests that are economic as well as social.
Thank you. So our first question is from Diana Espinoza, and as well as thanking you, she wants to know what is the most fundamental reason why they, which I presume means Trump supporters do not want to promote immigration?
There's a friend of mine, Alan Cross, who is born and raised in the South. He was a pastor in Alabama for a number of years. He's now a pastor in California. He wrote this amazing book, better around here somewhere. I think it was called Nations and the Church Collide. But it's about kind of the struggle among white Christianity around racial reconciliation. But I was talking to him, and he had this great way of putting it, is that for many people, there's a sense that immigration will take something from them, take their way of life, take a service or a program from them. And what people want to do, who are scared, legitimately scared, is that they want to hold on to what they've got. And they want to force the government and pressure the government to ensure that they continue to get what they believe is rightfully theirs. They've been led to believe that it's a zero-sum game, and that anybody coming into the country again is going to take something from them. So that's why, like in the living room conversations that I was referencing earlier, what we learned from there is that the fears that people have when it comes to immigration, they cut across culture, security, and economy. So culturally, the question is often that we heard was, are immigrants, are they going to integrate, or are they going to isolate? Are they going to learn English and become citizens, or are they going to remain among their own? From a security perspective, the question we'd often get from these very conservative rooms was, are immigrants here, are they threats or protectors? And then economically, are they givers or takers? So what Trump has done, and others in the Republican Party, is that they have made the case in a very visceral way that immigrants are isolating themselves, that they are threats, and that they're going to take something from you. And those of us who are advocates for immigration and immigrants, we have to answer those three questions in a way that's both creative, but in a way that doesn't dismiss those fears. But because I think if we can respect those fears, then we can actually have a conversation about what does smart policy look like.
Thank you. I do want to say that quite a few people have thanked you for your talk in the comments, which you're not seeing, so I wanted to make sure you know that. The next question is from Andres Velasquez, and he wants to know, do you think there might be a second civil war soon due to how divisive society is on various things like economy, religion, ethnicity, and I assume that immigration too, and what's the way to prevent this? So
I think there are amazing things that are happening at the local level. They're just amazing things. And, quite frankly, I think if we're all to turn off our television news and our Facebook feeds or Twitter feeds for a while, we'd probably all get along a heck of a lot better. So I'll give you, an example that I've been thinking about quite a bit recently, and that's in Twin Falls, Idaho. Twin Falls, Idaho is a city of about 50,000 in southwest or southeast Idaho. It's the home of it's like the West Coast home of Chobani yogurt. Idaho is a very conservative state. And in 2015 and 16, there was a massive misinformation effort by Alex Jones, by Breitbart, that started to scapegoat immigrants and refugees in Twin Falls as, in essence, terrorists. And this was all kind of when the Syrian refugee crisis was happening. And what was amazing is that of all people who stepped up and began the campaign to shift public sentiment, it was the Idaho Dairymen's Association, which is a bunch of I love these guys, but they're just a bunch of white dudes with big hats, right? But they worked with their immigrant communities for so long, they see them as an extension of their families. But also a young man named Zeze Razama, a refugee himself from Rwanda, who now runs the refugee resettlement program for the College of Southern Idaho. And between those two, Zeze and the Idaho Dairymen Association and the police chief in Twin Falls, Chobani, city government, they started to put together an education campaign where nobody would have to speak on their own anymore. They would all speak as one voice. And about a year or two ago, they came together and said, you know what? If this ever happens again in terms of this sort of a misinformation campaign around a very tragic incident, we're going to speak with one voice. And they worked together since then to build a unity alliance, where now you have, faith leaders, law enforcement leaders, business leaders, elected leaders working together to say, the Magic Valley of Idaho, where Twin Falls is located, is thriving because of immigrants and refugees. And across the country, there's so many stories like that where folks who, they voted for President Trump in 2016, they may very well voted for him in 2020, but they're not going to allow their communities to be torn apart by an immigration debate.
Thank you. I now have a couple of questions on immigration reform. There's questions about where do we stand with giving DACA recipients an actual path to residency? That's from Marissa Flores. There's another question of, do you see the possibility of an expansion of employment visas for high and low skilled level worker visas? And there's a question on what do you think about the current situation with the new president, President Biden's plan to legalize illegal immigrants? And that's from KB Sanchez.
Sure. So I apologize. I imagine a number of folks kind of hopped on the screen assuming that I was going to run through kind of that policy landscape, but I talk about that stuff all the time. So any opportunity I have to talk about other things, I do. So, but with that, let me give you kind of the quick DC rundown. And I think I won't do it in the order of the questions, but I think I'll get it to all your questions. So, on day one of the Biden administration, there were 7 executive orders related to immigration. Some of them made clear changes, others kind of set in place kind of processes to reprioritize enforcement actions, to look at the refugee resettlement cap. So from an executive order perspective, I think the Biden administration is off to a good start. They've got a lot of work to do in terms of reversing 1,000+ immigration changes from the Trump administration, and obviously a lot that's happening on the board that I'm happy to talk about from the DC perspective. Now, in terms of legislation, the U.S. Citizenship Act is a great piece of legislation. I mean, look, it would fully implement it, it would legalize 11 million undocumented immigrants on an 8-year path. It would expand various legal immigration pathways, and it would also, I would argue, really improve the sophistication of our border management and security practices, as opposed to just kind of the brute force strategies of past administrations. So on the whole, I think it's a great piece of legislation. Unfortunately, I think the chances of the legislative market bearing something of that size are slim, because quite frankly, it would require Republicans to come to the table on a pretty big piece of legislation. On the other hand, what we're going to see in the next couple of weeks on the House is that the House will likely pass the Dream and Profits Act, which would protect dreamers and recipients of temporary protected status. And also the Farm Work Modernization Act is likely also to be passed in the House in the next couple of weeks. Both of those pieces of legislation passed in the last Congress, so they can move on an expedited timeline, which then gets us to the Senate. Beginning around April 1, all eyes in the immigration world are going to be focused on 10 to 15 Republican senators, because we need to get to 60 votes in order for us to pass legislation in the Senate under current rules. So I think what will happen as we move through the spring and into the summer is that we'll see efforts to pass the DREAM Act, which has already been introduced by Senators Graham and Durbin. We'll see a farm work piece of legislation introduced in the Senate as well. So the idea is that on the Senate side, between the House and the Senate, that we move forward with what we're calling incremental reforms to begin the process that protect dreamers, that protect temporary protected status recipients, and farm workers. And I think that it is, if we all do our work, there's a very good chance that we can get to a place where we can get those 60 votes. So if you're good friends with Senator John Cornyn, feel free to give him a call early and quite often, because we're going to need his vote.
Thank you. One question that's come from the audience. I know in the audience you can't see how many people are here, but there's close to 250 people watching this. So if you're wondering, if you think you're alone, just listening to me and Mr. Narani talk about immigration, that's not true. There's 250 people with you.
I thought I was talking to you, George. This is news to me. What are you talking about?
We have a question from Jerry Schwebel. He says, many border citizens have the privilege of having parents who are immigrants from two countries. How can we address the growing violence against certain immigrants just because U.S. policy disagrees with their country? And I think here he's particularly talking about attacks on Asians.
Yeah, that's a great question, Jerry. And if you're the same Jerry that I know, Jerry Schwebel, so I just want to thank, again, IBC for the sponsorship here. So across the country, we've seen a spike in violence against the Asian American community, particularly the elderly Asian American community, and it's awful. It's just awful. And I think that the opportunity we have here, it's not the opportunity, it's the responsibility that we all have, is number one, to speak to these issues publicly, and to make sure that the Asian American community feels like they have allies across the country. Because, if any one of us are part of a minority community and we feel like we're under attack, we feel alone. So I think one of the most important things that we can do as a community is to make sure that nobody in the Asian American community feels like they're alone at this point in time. From a policy perspective, whether it's local, state, or federal, I think we need to be urging local law enforcement at all levels to improve their tracking of hate crimes. For years, the Department of Justice has really lagged in terms of their collection of hate crime data. Under the Obama administration, that started to improve. Under the Trump administration, it slid back. I think under the Biden administration, I would assume they're going to make an effort to improve that data collection, but that all starts local. So engaging your police chief, your sheriff, your mayor, your city council, so that there are the systems and the processes in place to track these hate crimes, gives us a better understanding of the challenges that we face, but also ultimately also holds people to account to commit hate crimes. So I think, again, kind of from our perspectives, we should all be in this together. But from a policy perspective, I think we have to do a much better job of tracking these crimes and holding the perpetrators accountable.
Thank you. I have a number of questions here, which I'm going to try to kind of join into one. They're asked in slightly different, but asked in similar ways. And they're related to what you can do to close the divide between Republicans and Democrats, between people for immigration, for people against immigration. And how do you deal with the issue of confirmation bias? And is it just a lack of reliable information that you see as the main reason for this anti-immigration sentiment?
Well, one of the things I should have said in my talk is that people's political identity is very strong. So in the example that I gave you of Tess Clark, she was kind of a bit of a unicorn in that she was going to say publicly to the New York Times that she was going to go from Republican to Democrat. Most people are not going to do that. In fact, what we found in our research and in our work is that if we encourage somebody who sees themselves as a Democrat to vote Republican or vice versa, they retrench and they kind of say, whoa, I'm not going to change my identity that drastically. So we've got to figure out ways where, Republicans are confident that they can pressure their member of Congress on these issues, that when it comes to that primary election, that they're outspoken in favor of the more moderate on immigration candidate in the Republican Party. And then that is kind of the political on-ramp to changing the politics of immigration at a federal level. But, I should have been more clear about this, but if we're going to assume that all of a sudden everybody who's Republican and loves immigrants and immigration is going to become Democrat or going to become Democrats, that's not a reasonable assumption. We've got to figure out the ways where there's almost like there's a pro-immigrant Republican in-group that is established. And that in-group, they don't see themselves as Democrats. They'll still see themselves as Republicans, but they do see themselves as people who are going to do everything they can within their power to push their party and their elected officials to a more constructive and rational place on immigration. And then kind of that difference between, somebody's personal priority of an aspiration versus kind of what they perceive to be society's aspirations, that gap will start to close. So I just think we have to we have to level set our expectations here, I think is perhaps a way to think about it.
I have a question now from Pedro Hernandez. He wants to know, what are your thoughts on the phrase American Dream and its importance of that phrase in American society today?
That's a really good question. You know, I mentioned this in when I was speaking, is that I think as a country, we want to make sure that all of us, regardless of where we're born, regardless of our race or our gender or orientation or age, that we can reach our fullest potential. And for all of us, our potential is going to be different. And I think what we hope and we desire is that the system, the public sector, the government, does everything in its power to help all of us reach our potential. And I think that, you know, my sense is that that's a better way to think about this other than American Dream, because I think oftentimes, you know, for me at least, I grew up thinking, well, the American Dream is, you know, some definition of my worth in terms of wealth or, you know, financial stability. But, you know, I think if we are thinking of each other and helping each other reach our fullest potential, we do that in so many different ways that are just as, if not more important than the monetary wealth that we may get. And that, I think, at the end of the day, is probably a better way to think about this than you know, an American Dream per se.
Thank you. My next question is from Dr. Balaji Janamachi, one of the professors at TAMIU, and he wants to know, your 7-point policy sounds excellent. However, is there any survey-based evidence that such a policy is acceptable to all stakeholders, or how can we develop such acceptance by all?
Well, I mean, everybody that I'm seeing on the screen is raising their hand, saying it's the best policy. So that's a good question. It's not a policy plan that we've survey tested per se, but the language, you know, but each one of those measures, I know through individual surveys, resonates. And a lot of this is in the framing, right? So in that 7th one, for example, I talked about English language and citizenship, because I know that polling will always show that, well, many people who are skeptical or opposed to immigration, one of their questions is, are immigrants going to integrate into the U.S. and learn English and become citizens? So let's make it affirmatively part of the plan that is the commitment. You know, talking about you know, safety and security on the border. You know, a lot of my friends on the left, to my left, would never say something like that. They would be loath to ever say publicly, yes, we need to, you know, have border measures. But from our perspective, we know that the majority of the American public believes in a secure border. So let's think about and present the solutions that achieve a secure border, but achieve a secure border in a rational, humane, and also in a cost-efficient way. So, you know, there are many elements of that kind of 7-point plan that have been poll tested in a lot of different ways.
The next question is from Jose Ceballos, and he wants to know, what advice do you have for NGOs serving and assisting migrants when the new administration does not seem to be changing the process or facilities quick enough? And I guess my question would be, do you agree that the new administration is not changing the process or facilities quick enough?
Yeah, I mean, we've been talking quite a bit to the administration, both, you know, and you know, it's very, let me put it this way. It's very easy for me to say in Washington, D.C. to be patient and to let the new administration kind of get their footing, put in place the plans and the infrastructure so that things can work smoothly. That is very easy for me to say. And it's also very unfair for me to say. Because at the end of the day, there are lives on the line in and along the border, whether on the Mexico side or on the U.S. side. So I think what we all have to do, whether we're based in D.C. or along the border, is to speak with the moral urgency that is the facts on the ground, and to continue to pressure and to urge the administration to change their processes, to put into place the infrastructure that's necessary to process asylum claims, to protect unaccompanied children as they're going, as they're presenting at the border and waiting to join with a guardian. Yes, this stuff takes time, but it's our job as community-based organizations and advocates to speak to the moral urgency of the challenge that we face.
Thank you. And the next question is from Eliza Gonzalez, and she wants to know, what are the steps to improve the immigration process? Will having more immigration judges help the process to legally accept immigrants faster and provide resources such as work visas?
So I think there are a couple things here. One is in terms of asylum processing on the border. One of the, so we're advocating for a handful of things. One is more immigration judges so that they are at the border. But make sure that those immigration judges have the latitude and the ability to use their expertise to adjudicate cases. Under the previous administration, immigration judges were handcuffed in many ways, either by quotas or by precedent-setting rulings by the Attorney General that really hemmed in the ability of immigration judges to use their expertise to adjudicate claims. So yes, more immigration judges are important, but making sure that they have the expertise and they're able to use their expertise is probably even more important. Second, as a deployment of asylum officers to the border so that individuals can go through their credible fear interviews quickly, but they can have that interview be conducted by someone who's trained as an asylum officer. CBP, Customs and Border Protection agents and officers should not be conducting credible fear interviews. It's just not part of their training as they have gone through their career. So those are two processing recommendations that we have along the border. But in terms of legal immigration visas, that's very much a USCIS function. I think it's really important that the administration is looking across the board of changes the Trump administration made to U.S. citizenship and immigration services, reconstituting efforts to streamline the process, making sure that the resources are in place to reduce the backlog of over 1 million visa and naturalization applications. But then also, so there's things that need to be done on the USCIS side to, again, kind of streamline the process. But then, we just released a new paper that you can find on our website, immigrationforum.org, and the paper is called Room to Grow. And it was the first time for us as an organization where we were clear in terms of the number of immigrants that we need to bring into the United States per year. So if it's okay, let me kind of go through the top line of it. Right now, we welcome or we recruit about 1 million immigrants per year. And this is through the mix of family immigration and work immigration. My colleague Danilo Zach and I looked at the old age dependency ratio, in essence, the ratio of working age adults to retirees. Currently, that ratio is about 3.54. If we do not increase immigration in the next 20, 30, 50 years, but we also assume that people will work longer, that old age dependency ratio will start to decrease to 2.7 or potentially even lower, which just makes it all the more likely that our Social Security system will be severely depleted by 2034 or beyond. So all to say, put these pieces together, we believe that just to maintain our current ratio of 3.54 working age adults to retirees, we need to increase legal immigration by 37%, or 370,000. And that can come family immigration, work immigration, everybody's contributing in one way or another. So but that has to be done through legislative action and can't just be done by the Biden administration. But we're really trying to wrap our heads around, what do we need to do from a legal immigration perspective to, frankly, ensure the solvency of our economy.
Thank you. Our next question is from Martin Tovar. He says that many people, especially younger people, get generation from apps that you mentioned, such as Facebook and Twitter, which can be biased based upon the person who's posting. And his question is, what do you recommend as the most reliable sources to get your information from?
I mean, the Laredo News, of course, right? I mean, so I'll just kind of give you from my perspective. I mean, from my perspective, every day, I'm trying to make sure that I get my news from a variety of sources. Some sources that would be seen as, center left, others that would be seen as center right. And for all of us in this day and age, if we have the time, we can create the time, we've got to be able to do that. And sometimes that's as simple as me making sure that in my Twitter feed is diverse, right? Is coming from a diverse set of resources. That again, I'm kind of taking the time in the morning to just kind of touch on different sources of news so that I have a sense of, okay, who's saying what and how does it match with another source or how does it differ? And that takes time. But I think like if any of the students in this conversation are looking forward to a career in public policy or in the public sector, being able to kind of train yourself and have the discipline to do that is just incredibly important. I mean, I would just argue, it's also just incredibly important in terms of being a citizen these days and, trying to get all of us out of our respective bubbles.
A related question, which I probably should have pulled in with this one, from Carolina Ramirez. She wants to know, what types of media would you specifically suggest that are not biased or leaning into an ideology?
Mm-hmm. Not biased. Everything's biased. This is the thing. I think, there's nothing I read that I don't assume is biased. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? Like if you just kind of say, okay, I'm reading this and there's a human being who's writing it. So that human being has a bias. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's our job as the reader to discern that bias and to compare it with another source. And I know that's like a very unfair answer to a really important question. But there's no simple answer these days to this. And I think that folks who are growing up now, you're a lot smarter about kind of where you get your information and how you get your information than folks in my generation or older. So it's all on you.
A question now from Betsy Paredes, and I think this relates to one of your points from your 7-point policy. She said, what do you think of building the wall? Did you think it was a waste of time and money?
I thought it was a waste of time and money. If the majority of drugs, guns, and money are being smuggled through ports of entry, if that's where economies on either side of the border are depending on trade, we should be investing almost every single dollar that we have at our land ports of entry. It makes sense from a security perspective. It makes sense from an economic perspective. To spend, I don't have in front of me kind of what the final amount of billions of dollars the Trump administration spent on these massive, pieces of infrastructure in the middle of the desert. All those are doing are pushing desperate migrants into more desperate situations, and that's does nothing to solve a security problem, and it only treats migrants and again all of us with less dignity.
The next question is a historical question from Marcos Resendes. He says, in your opinion, is there a point in time where you believe that the nation's view of immigrants shifted from contributors to takers?
That is a great question. There's this amazing book that was written last year. It's called A Mighty and Irresistible Tide. And I can see her name. I've interviewed her. I'm blanking on the name of the author, but it's a brilliant book because she looks at the immigration debate between 1924, in essence, kind of where the country put into place its first quotas around immigration, to 1965, where those quotas were lifted and President Johnson really kind of brought the United States into the modern era. And the book is incredible because it doesn't dwell on the policy details. She writes about the politics of the moment, right? So around World War II, where there was an effort to make sure that refugees could find protection in the U.S., but We had no refugee program. And what were the forces against that program? Some of them were nativist, some of them were populist, over the course of the 50s. And then, what were the pieces that started to fall into place in the late 50s and the early 60s, so that finally you had the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act. And remember, in 1924, that's 40, 50 years after the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. So, to answer your question, it's I hate to say it, but it's been a pretty consistent theme of the United States kind of treatment of immigrants is always this question of, is the immigrant taking something from us? And there's always these ebbs and flows of that question and, how we answer it and, what that debate looks like. But I would just really, I highly recommend that book, Mighty and Irresistible Tide. I just, it was an amazing book.
We now have a question from Diana Espinoza, and she framed this as a statement, but I think I'll phrase it as a question. She says, do you believe that Trump supporters are afraid of immigrant Hispanics because they're afraid they might become U.S. citizens and then vote? She also says, in her view, Hispanics are very capable to take over the main leadership roles in the country anyway.
Along the lines of your statement there, Diana, it's even if immigration was to stop today, we as a nation will continue to get more diverse, and you'd see a natural growth in the Hispanic community just based on the size of the community now. So you're absolutely right. The trajectory is that over time we're going to see more and more Hispanics and other communities of color in leadership roles, and there's no way to stop that. I'm not sure if Trump supporters are afraid of Hispanics becoming U.S. citizens. So, I've always thought that every time we as a country have had an immigration debate, so much of the debate, ends up focusing on, legalization of undocumented, excuse me, path to citizenship or not. But that's never really the reason why the legislation falls apart, right? Because there's always a deal that's worked out on that. It's 8 years, it's 10 years, pay this fine, pay that fine. That deal is always cut. The deal that's always been impossible to cut is, what does the future of immigration look like? So even now when you look at the polling, there's pretty broad public support for legalization of undocumented immigrants who are here already, who are here today. That number can be 60 to 80% in support. When you ask the question of, okay, the future of immigration, then support gets a lot more difficult. So, I talked about those aspirations, right? Severe restriction or openness. You just saw those differences. So I'm not sure citizenship is the question. I think the question is, for a far right-wing part of the Republican Party, the question is really, do you want another immigrant here in the U.S.? Which then kind of gets you back to that question of, okay, if you want to retire and be able to depend on Social Security, you need a number of immigrants coming into the U.S. and contributing to our economy.
Thank you. The next question is a little bit of pushback from one of your policies. It's from Miguel Silva, and he says, "Why is learning English required to integrate? It sounds regressive. Wouldn't we want to push for all people to learn more languages rather than just immigrants to learn English?"
Miguel, I would agree with you. I think all people should learn multiple languages. There's no doubt about that. And I think that what you see in schools across the country now in terms of immersion programs, whether it's Mandarin, Spanish, or otherwise, I think is tremendous. And I think it bodes well for all of us in our nation moving forward. And as the professor asked the question earlier about, is this policy platform kind of based on public opinion? That particular item, absolutely, because the folks that we are trying to persuade, look, Miguel, I'm going to assume that you and I agree that we as a country benefit from immigrants and immigration. We don't need to be convinced. We need to help folks who are really struggling and skeptical of immigration to see why immigrants and immigration are good for them and good for their families. And part of their concerns are whether or not immigrants will learn English. And that may, and I also want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to an audience, at the U.S.-Mexico border where, Spanish is ubiquitous, right? But kind of go back to that community I was talking about in Twin Falls. Spanish is not ubiquitous in Twin Falls, Idaho. Those kinds of questions really resonate. Those kinds of concerns really resonate. So I think as we're having this conversation across the country, always trying to understand kind of what those fears are, and being able to address those fears. But, I would admit that, on our part, on my part, being more nuanced in terms of how do you make that case so that, yes, immigrants and all of us should be committed to learning English, but we should also be committed to learning multiple languages because that helps our economic competitiveness across the board.
Thank you. We have time for a couple more questions. I firstly want to apologize to anyone whose question I haven't asked, or if I over-paraphrased your question. And I know I'm trying to keep the conversation going, so I apologize to you. I know my questioning has been imperfect. Anyway, the next question is from Diego Ceniceros, and he says, will the U.S. always be a two-party system? Will it be possible for other parties to emerge that are not as polarizing?
I think that some of the things that are happening, like in, Nebraska, Arizona, are really interesting because, I don't think we as a country are close to having a multi-party system. But the states that have, for example, open primaries, what happens is that, Democrats and Republicans are competing for a limited number of primary seats, and that naturally is moderating the end results of those primary elections. So I think that there are tactics such as open primaries that I think bode well for the future of our democracy. Obviously the redistricting and gerrymandering and who controls that process is a pretty big problem. I think that the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act is incredibly important for all communities. But I hesitate to say we should be thinking very seriously about more than a two-party system, at least at this point in time. I think that there are intermediate steps that can hopefully get us back on the rails.
Thanks. Okay, so I think maybe two or three more questions. From Michael Pisani, what does the future hold for the EB-5 Immigrant Investor Program?
Oh, that's a nitty-gritty immigration lawyer question. So I know a little bit about this program. I know that it's always kind of, subject to reauthorization by Congress. It feels like every 2 or 3 months, but you probably know better than me, Michael. I think that the question is always come down to, Senator Grassley from Iowa has always had a very kind of does not really like this program in the way that it's been styled. I think a lot of this, quite frankly, is going to be, how the Senate Judiciary Committee handles the issue. And I would say that the advocates for EB-5 have been very creative in terms of, addressing the EB-5 visa issue through other vehicles too. So it's just, at least at this early juncture in this Congress and with this administration, I haven't seen anything come across my screen in terms of, how it's all going to play out.
Thank you. I think this will be our last question, unfortunately. I know I missed a couple, and I apologize if your question didn't get asked. But we'd like to keep him here forever, but he has important things to do with so much going on in Washington. So our next question is from Rita Isanbedo, and she said, what advice do you have for corporate leaders who are eager to improve and enhance diversity and inclusion initiatives in ways that directly impact immigrants in the workforce?
That's a fantastic question, Rita. In fact, it's kind of like my perfect way to end. So I think that, so one of the programs that we started a number of years ago is called New American Workforce. And what we've done across the country is engage corporations and businesses in this idea of worksite-based immigrant integration. So now, for example, we're working with Walmart, which is the largest private employer in the country. If you work for Walmart and you go on their intranet site that's open to associates only, you'll see a link to New American Workforce. You click that link and you can begin the naturalization application process. So Walmart, through that and kind of internal marketing efforts, they're facilitating access for their associates to naturalization. On our end, we make sure that there's quality control in the application and that people can get their questions answered, et cetera. Best Buy is starting the program as well, and there are a number of other employers, big and small, across the country. So one way is that employers are facilitating access to naturalization so that people can not just reach their American dream, but also reach their fullest potential. Because oftentimes the research shows that with naturalization, earning opportunities for families increases. Second program that we started kind of in this context is called English at Work, where we're working with companies across the country to provide a contextualized English language learning program. So for example, in Houston, we had worked with Kroger, where Kroger would, we'd work with them to identify a set of employees. Over the course of 16 weeks, we would provide a contextualized English language learning program so that the individual who's a Kroger employee could improve their English language skills based on, in essence, the vocabulary that they use every single day at Kroger's. And what we found in the second year is that almost 40% of people who completed that program received a promotion because of increased English language skills. So those are a couple of just kind of nuts and bolts. But I think third, and perhaps most importantly, is that corporate leadership, whether it's kind of mid-level or senior level, are speaking to the value of immigrants and immigration. And not necessarily only kind of in the context of immigration reform, say around Dreamers or otherwise, but really kind of what does the social and economic value of immigration to the country mean to corporate leader A, B, or C? I mean, I know obviously IBC Bank and Commerce are very outspoken about their belief that Texas and the country are improved because of immigrants and immigration. So I think that the more that corporate leaders are doing that, the better. And along the way, there are kind of very nuts and bolts opportunities to improve the lives of immigrants as well. So thank you.
Well, that's all we have time for. So thank you very much, Dr. Noorani, for this fabulous presentation. I think it wasn't quite what I expected. As you said, I thought there'd be much more on the nuts and bolts of immigration law. So it was absolutely fascinating. So thank you very much. I think we've all learned a lot from you. I want to thank, of course, once again, IBC and Commerce Bank and those people who work there who would like to clap for, but you can't hear us because you can't see us. You only hear me clapping by myself. So we want to thank you for your sponsorship of this, and it's great to bring these kind of speakers on these important issues to Laredo, even if you only came virtually this time. And finally, I'd like to thank all the students and all the community members who came and attended. I hope that you've enjoyed it, and I hope that you've learned something from it. So thank you very much for everybody, and thank you, Dr. Noorani.
Hey, and by the way, I'm a doctor of nothing, just Ali, but hopefully I'll see everybody in person at some point soon. Take care. Thank you.